James, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Really excited for our conversation. We've been able to chat about some of your journey and where you're coming from and what you'd like to discuss in terms of the interests you have. But yeah, we're wanting to explore a lot of things today. So we'll just jump right into it. But just to give the listeners a bit of context, I'd like to give you an opportunity to share with us a little bit about yourself and what's brought you here today.
Thanks, Furkan, for having me on the show. I am a PhD trained anthropologist. I left academia early and I entered the business world for the sake of salary. And I had a passion, I think, from a young age for that sort of led me to get my anthropology doctorate for understanding social life, the things that confuse me about social life specifically, which is a lot because I'm high functioning autistic. It took me a little longer than most to get socially fluent. And so I have a new book that is a lifelong project of exploring individualism as a way of life. And I lived in India for 3 years during my graduate research, and that helped. It helped me personally a lot. We can get into that, but I think it just helped provide this lifelong contrast that there's a totally other way of living. It's not better or worse, just very different. And that I think is the inspiration for why I'm here on the show is because when I came back from that cultural immersion, I went through a lot of culture shock and I settled down. I got a career and I did all the things that you're supposed to do. I did them later than most people. And I went through my own mental crisis.
Yeah.
Um, and we'll talk a little bit about that, I'm sure. But the book is, it probably is a healing act, but I didn't really think about it conscious.
Yeah.
So that's my intro.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Thank you. So, right off the bat, I guess one of the things I'm curious about is, you talked about the cultural contrast that you experienced in India. Are you able to shed some light from your perspective on what you noticed there and why was it such a shock coming back to the United States?
I would say the biggest dimension of culture shock was when I came back and then essentially started to reestablish an apartment, right? This classic sort of young adult thing that people do when they're single. I had this transition. I had a soft landing with my family, so I had to do some local research at a library. So I was with them for about 2 months. After I got out of the soft landing, I was thrown full face back into the incredible alienation of just being a single adult in a town that you were not born in, which you don't have like a native social network in. Like a lot of post grad people, we move around a lot for school and other things. And so you're often perpetually in a community that you don't actually have any deep social roots in. That's pretty common. So to go from India, where I felt like I always had someone to talk to, know if they knew me, they didn't know me, but there's always somebody to talk to. Just the distracting power of social interaction is underestimated, I think, because it distracts you from rumination, overthink, um, things that introverts like me tend to do if left alone,
Right.
or anyone,
Yeah.
but really me. And I think we could call it loneliness. And yes, that's what it felt like. But I think that it's just a lack of someone to, the fact that it's like an effort in America to go find,
Yeah.
it's an effort. It's a project to go find someone to talk to.
Hearing
Like,
is, yeah. Yeah. So, what I'm hearing is like you were on your own there when you came back and you experienced a sense of isolation, whereas in India, it wasn't that the case because you could actually carry on conversation with other people. Do you feel that's a reflection of the collectivistic culture versus the more individualistic culture in the Western world, perhaps, if we were to look at it on a macroscopic level? Do you think that's the difference there, or is there more to it that?
yeah, I actually think it has to do with the concept of the stranger. And I don't know that perfectly lines up with that continuum you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Someone may have studied that. I don't know, but the the way that cultures and societies that are where the average person is more embedded in their family and is more into community tend to process strangers very different. And it's not, this isn't necessarily a good thing. I don't, for anyone who's been to India, it doesn't matter where in the country, but if you because you're probably marked as a foreigner, either with your clothes or your skin color. And so you go in and people are going to start processing you. People come up to you and demand to know what's going on. At the very least, all eyes will be on you. And when that happens, man, you don't forget something like that. When that happens the first time in your life, like 100 people staring at you as you walk down the street. And so that processing of the stranger, it leads to it's like a quick choose your own adventure. And basically they're going to find a place to place you. They're going to position you, whether you like it or not. The funny thing is that actually makes talking and conversing and interacting so much easier. It just makes it effortless, absolutely seamless. Contrast what it was like coming back to the US and living as a single person, where, I mean, I think we're all tacitly aware of this. You could just you could just wander around in circles all day and no one would say anything. You could just circle your apartment block like infinitely, and I don't think anyone would even notice you're doing something so weird, let alone actually say anything, unless you do something else that looks vaguely threatening. Non-Western cultures, not all of them, but most of them actually. It's not really about India. It has nothing to do with that. If you go into any rural community in the world, it's probably very similar, even in the US and Canada. But it's going to be, they're going to suck you in. And so they got to figure out who you are, what the deal is, and how you fit in. And that's the sign of a tighter community. They just want to understand how you fit in. In more hyper individualistic societies like ours, it's just, we believe so much in the shield of extreme individual privacy that the public isn't allowed to really inquire what you're doing until you get super weird. Basically, it has to be threatening.
Yeah.
If you're walking around your block in circles, most people probably won't notice that because there aren't eyes on the street here. Now, if you walk up and down, you start trying to open everybody's car door, people might notice that.
Right. Yeah. So what you're identifying is once you present yourself as a threat, that's when it becomes an issue. Now I'm wondering, and again, I can't really understand your lived experience, but I am curious to understand from your perspective, like being in India, obviously there's a lot of history with imperialism and colonialism, especially from the British Empire. So they do have a bit of a visceral reaction, from my understanding, when they see someone of your color. I'm wondering, did that factor in at times for you? And how was that an experience also?
That increased the likelihood of them positioning me like a circus freak, basically.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, it was mostly positive, overwhelmingly. Actually, and many people will tell you this, like when you embed in a community, generally you get treated like a VIP, despite colonialism. It's very ironic.
Yeah.
So to me, it was, once you get over the fact that everyone's staring at you all the time, when that just encourages you not to go anywhere.
Yeah.
Like you just hang out in your local hood and it's all the staring stops, and then you just become some local oddity. But never had a problem talking to people or finding someone to talk to. And I think that just the power of easy sort of chitty chat, the ease with which you can do that in more hyper connected societies, is, there's such a mental health benefit. I said this on another show, like my mental health was fantastic while I lived in India, but I was almost killed 3 times, like physically attacked twice. But my mental health baseline was so much better because I had constant interaction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have a neurology where I will literally just read books all day unless someone says something. It's just, I will disappear. If I just tried to hide, if I had done an experiment, hide in my apartment, people would have started banging on the door. And that just wouldn't have happened in Madison, Wisconsin as a graduate student. Like I probably could have been dead for at least a week in my apartment. If that, to me, that, as a social scientist, but also just as a human being, that is just extremely disturbing contrast, because I don't think we understand that the way we've set up the rules here, we have to work to maintain our social network. In traditional human societies, the network is constantly regenerating itself every second. Right?
Yeah.
It's not like you become alienated. Oh, I got really busy and I didn't get in touch with my friends. Now I reconnect with my friends. This is completely a Western problem. This is a totally arbitrary. We don't have to live like we
Yeah.
don't want, but we do. And I didn't realize how bad the problem was until I came back.
Mm.
So my mental health was a lot better in India, like significantly better. When I came back, I had much more self-awareness. I'm like, oh, I really have to work hard to make friends, to
Mm.
sustain, to insert myself into social life. I've got to constantly fight to be in social.
Mhm.
And I did. I did by doing it. I started joining activities like swing dancing that would force me into social rhythm. And that was my big takeaway from India. It was like, America's not going to do it for you because nobody cares. So you're going to have to force that. And it's not the end of the world. You can figure it out.
Yeah.
But you can't just be in school and expect these things to happen. It just
Mm.
doesn't. We don't have, as I say in my book, we don't have a structured process for young adults to become full-fledged adults. There's no ritual. There's no nothing. It's
Right.
basically a giant free-for-all.
Mhm. Right.
A bunch of people do really well. Do
Right.
fine.
Yeah. So it's fairly arbitrary from what you're saying there. And some of the cultures like India, they have more of a rite of passage for individuals to get into that adult. Earlier, you mentioned the impact it had on your mental health, and you talked about some of the ways you were able to navigate that when you were in the United States again. But what was going on with your mental health? So I know you touched on the isolation piece and really having to make an effort to socially integrate. But
Yeah.
what was going on with the psyche in that sense?
I would say my nadir was actually career related more than did I feel like socially integrated because I, I chose the path. I chose a path that was academic. And so it's not that they're trying to become a writer. It's basically it's a self-invented identity. It's all about you, what convergence of luck you can manufacture. And I think the connection to what we're just talking about was that I hit my second major depressive sort of episode in my life, basically right after I got my PhD approved. It's just like literally my anticlimactic gift was depression. I already knew that I was going to have to leave academia because my advisor was not on my side. There was nobody else. And I think my experience in India, I hadn't been to therapy yet, so I was winging this self-analysis, which is never a great idea, by the way, if you can possibly get professional conversation help. The conclusion I came to is that and I wrote about this in my book, that I had failed in graduate school to be a power network, right? The people getting jobs in oversupplied fields are people who are networking masters, right? It's actually no different than business and other sectors, right? When there's too many talented people who all have the same level of talent and can contribute the same thing to the field, then it becomes a completely superficial high school game.
Hmm.
Now, I'm high functioning autistic, so I don't do superficial high school games. I just run.
Right.
Or I get really angry, to be honest. Like I do both. And I did. So I went through a period. And I think very common. I mean, much more common than mental illness of a clinical nature, but just a classic depressive period where I had to grieve somehow dysfunctionally that I had to walk away from a career I had spent the last 15 years obsessing. And that I did not process the grief around that. I didn't recognize it as grief. I recognized the anger, and all I wanted to do was redirect the anger and get beyond that. Probably that was a healthy motive, but I didn't never deal with the grief. That affected me for the next 5 years as I tried to integrate into the business world because everything became a comparison between this work I'm doing for corporate America versus what I could have been doing. Just
Hmm.
constant, unhelpful. And that's what happens when you don't grieve a career loss. Is you're still back there. Half of you still back there trying to make it work, and the other
Right.
half is badly adapting to the new reality. And you talk about something where there's no structured help in Western society. It's like probably the most critical one in terms of mental well-being is there is absolutely no new ritual for career or employment. There's nothing, and yet this is happening to millions of people a year. That's what blows me away.
Right.
This is not some like weird case of PhD. It's happening in it happened in COVID because people had to go take care of their parents and then their career implodes. And did they grieve the loss of the career caused by their family care duties? I don't know. I hope so, but I doubt it, because we don't have a society that's actually monitoring everybody's mental well-being. When I lived in India, I had people commenting on my mood all the time. And my mood as an American and someone who's autistic, it's very roller coaster. So I can be difficult to live with and be around even here. But they would tell me, they would comment.
Yeah.
And that's an invitation to share.
Yeah.
But in our society, in our social setup, you could be in that spiral and put on a mask for months and months. And again, so I don't want to pry. Either because you don't want to hear or you don't know what to say is actually the problem. Right?
Yeah. 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 No, it's an interesting dichotomy that you're sharing here, because most of the time we can make the argument that places like India, again, that's the example we're using here, perhaps don't have the same level of awareness and understanding when it comes to health. They're perhaps lacking a little bit, or lagging for that matter. It's the Western world talking more about mental health, more at the forefront, people's conscious awareness. But there are certain things that we do socially that can affect or have a verse effect actually on people's mental health in the Western world versus places like India, where people are more tuned with other people's emotions. So that's something you had mentioned to me as well, was this whole idea
Yeah.
of emotionally intelligent culture there. But that on paper, that might not be the case. And that's not something people would historically talk about, right? That's not something
So
that,
I think,
yeah,
this is not my area of expertise. There are medical anthropologists I know who study cross-cultural dynamics in great detail, but I can riff on what I've read about, and I can say that what you're getting at, generally, classical civilizations in the Eastern world generally have been slow to deal with severe psychiatric illness. So when you go down into that particular rabbit hole, we have better solutions. Most of them are pharmacological. We're talking about, I have an aunt who's bipolar, so I have some
well, and
exposure to what,
that's
those are
subjective
very
too.
rare illnesses, right? Like what I just described to you, which is career loss grief, that's essentially a mass phenomenon. It's going to happen to more than half the population in their working life. Something's really bad in their careers going to happen. And they're going to have to grieve that and deal with it. And what's interesting to me is that if crudely put, if like South Indian culture is really good at keeping people connected and monitoring baseline mental well-being, which may or may not, it should not require a professional therapist to keep that baseline. The fact that you have a career and that other people have a career in this field, and I use therapists, they're valuable, is an adaptation to a system that puts ridiculous stress on the individual. That's my personal belief, is that it's a positive functional adaptation to a problem caused elsewhere in the structure of society.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the average South Indian person needs therapy, to be honest, right? If they're in functional family community, because their baseline is probably doing a lot better.
Yeah.
I can't show you data, but I could point listeners to studies that have been done of the Amish communities in the US, who we have better access to because they receive things like state aid and other things, so they can go in and pry and do studies on them. But they have found that Amish women have much lower rates of depression and anxiety than the average American woman in the United States.
Do you feel like that's
by orders of magnitude that are way beyond the margin of error, right?
Yeah.
And you can relate that to the structure, predictability, greater degree of certainty in their way of life.
And I guess my follow-up question is, do you feel that's a product of the simplicity of life too, right? Because you can argue in the more rural areas, we tend to have a bit more stress, right? More work. We tend to work more hours. We've got more bills, more materialistic things that are stress inducing. So I wonder how much of that is a product of the lifestyles we tend to live as well.
Yeah. And when I did the seventh chapter of my book it may actually not be that interesting to most of my readers. I have no way to survey them yet, but it was the one of the most interesting for me to write because I did a social history of household expenditure. There's a wonderful document that Congress put together comparing data from 1900 and 2021. And so when you look at what people are spending on and how baseline expenditure of housing has gone up when you adjust for inflation and household, the per capita spending on housing has gone up in 120 years. The food expenditure has gone down, but then we've added things like insurance. Didn't even exist. That wasn't even a line item, right? So our lifestyle is more expensive, even for the most struggling working class person. It's more expensive to sustain what we think of as normal. That to me is a classic anthropological case of what in sports they'd call it an unforced error. You don't have to do this. You don't have to make these assumptions, right? Your suffering is caused by assumptions that you are making about how to live. And to your point, the urban people live in a mediaverse, which is basically just drowning them in alternative choice, which to the human mind, humans are wired to make hierarchical comparisons. So it's not an innocent thing to flood your screens with alternative lifestyle choices. Your brain, whether you're aware of it or not, is going to start to say that's better or worse than how I live now. That's a better or worse activity. I should add that activity. Or I'm better than that person doing that activity. Everything becomes hierarchical imperative. And that's exhausting. It is cognitively exhausting. And I've noticed just as smartphones, because I was on smartphone super early, because my old boss he bought some first gen iPhones and gave. So I got sucked into this screen garbage really fast. And it was amazing to me how much more choice was presented on a daily basis.
Right.
Didn't ask for it. Don't care really. But see, the problem is it doesn't matter if you care. It's there. Yeah. And it's just, and we're trained and we're sucked into video. Mm-hmm. I think that's a human thing. Video is so much more powerful a distracting force. But that choice issue becomes important because if you live in a society that's not constantly presenting you a lot of choice, your decision flow during the day, there's a lot fewer decisions you're making. You're not shutting out as much noise. A related story, there was a kid I was friends with in the community in South India I lived with who had basically come from the village, was doing this classic thing that you do when you're trying to get out of rural poverty, which, again, poverty is relativistically defined to an urban standard. You got to take that with a grain of salt. Like this is not a guy who was starving, right? Not a malnourished tribal person in the mountains of India. He was stable. There was a family. They had land. There was a life. He wanted to become something what he thought was superior, make more money by coming to urban India in the city where I was living and have a go at it. And it was a complete disaster. And in India, because I think it's actually worse than here, but there's no way for me to quantify it, but I suspect it's worse. I think there's a deeper shame about the individual going into the city and failing there. And so the depth and expansiveness of the lies were unbelievable. And at first I thought these people were like sociopaths. And I know this is actually a cultural reaction to the failure because their family probably isn't rooting for them. Someone in the family. The I told you so crap.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, there was just an inability to deal with reality that this is not working out. And I think I did hear stories of people who just go back. And that never gets written about in the Indian press, the Indian media. Nobody's studying. People who go and say, you know what? It wasn't so bad. Again, yeah. I'm not talking about malnourished, low caste Dalits or people like that who are actually being abused. I'm talking about probably people from the landowning caste who going into the city trying to make a better life for themselves. They find it wasn't that bad, right? Because if they're actually able to dance between two extreme worlds that most Americans don't have access, they can't do that with one bus ride. They just don't. I felt it too when I was there doing field research. I could go 1 hour out from the city and it was like, I might as well been in like northern Thailand, like in the mountains. It's crazy. So I think that when the individual sticks their neck out in a society with and tries to stand out, it takes actually more force in a country. It takes more force of will than it does here. It's really easy to escape here. If you just have some desire to upgrade your life, like my dad developed at the end of his high school, it's extremely easy to abandon your family and just disappear. It's not as easy in other cultures.
Right.
They will come find what is going on. What are you doing? So hence, maybe that's the explanation for all the lying, because you got to keep them from, there's all this surveillance, right? Like, how you doing? How's it going in the apartment? There's the constant surveillance. So you're going to have to constantly do smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
And I could tell from the outside how incredibly stressful that was. And I think, so trying to be hyper individualist in a country like India is actually very different. It happens. There's tons of people like that. It's a totally different context. It's a very different game. I can't sit here and applaud it though, because a lot of people are just driving themselves into ditch. So that's one way you can become mentally unwell in India really fast.
Right.
And I don't know that you see the same dynamic, because escaping your family and doing better is coded as a positive thing here. So you don't have to do the smoking
Right.
nearly as much.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, you can literally not call them.
For sure.
It's
Yeah.
just-
No, and I appreciate that. And I think just it's important to discern between the two, and then obviously pros and cons with both. But the other thing we touched on, especially in the Western world, access to therapy and psychiatrists, as we talking about, we're talking about a lot of the solution pharmacology. That can also have unintended consequences. Now, another unintended consequence I do want to talk about is this notion that we tend to then become a victim. And, now we've been given all these tools to seek out help, but it's very easy to internalize a victim mentality
Mhm.
and feel like a victim in your story, because now you have people who are supporting that world. Whereas in some of the cultures, like going back to India, you don't necessarily have that luxury, because everyone around you is pulling up their bootstraps together and getting to work. You don't have the time to be a victim. And if you do, you often tend to get isolated from that culture, or isolated out of whatever structure you're a part of, because again, like I said, you don't have the time to be a victim. You have to keep moving on or just fall behind. Whereas here, you can see tendency nurturing that in a sense.
Yeah, my brain is immediately going to this family that I became very close to in the community I was doing research in, and they actually, they were Dalits, but the dad was like a Dalit activist. And so he was very much into his victim identity. Like, he dressed in it every day, and he would use it as a weapon. It was not effective. All it did was alienate his children and himself from everyone around him. So you can find that in India, and I'm just struggling to understand. It just never occurred to me to compare. And I think the answer may be very simple, is that if your path to social mobility in India is based on trying to engage in a victim identity-led fight, actually the landlords of your natal village in your head or a city, this is a dysfunction that's very Indian.
Right.
Because the guy's not even there. He got out.
Yeah.
No, to an objective social scientist, it's my God, you're actually not doing that bad. But it's not for me to judge whether someone has been victimized. Have you been victimized? So when I was working with that family, I could sense both sides of the critique. Like, he was basically a whiner. He was the local whiner. But I saw it a little differently. I saw him having a dysfunctional reaction to various classic social forces, right? He had been brought into the city, but he was never going to go anywhere as a Dublin. He had his little government job, but that was never going to turn into anything else. Right. I think to him, the city was a place where he could get the government job, government pension, and then suddenly, I think he had a fantasy that this hell from the village would just disappear. No, it just reproduces so differently. And so, in a way, he was a really angry guy who did not agree with his issue. But his issue was very urban and modern. And so so I agree with you that getting trapped in a victim mentality, I don't care what social position you're coming from, if you actually get trapped in that and you're only processing the world from the perspective of what has been done to me, you're actually just living in the past, right? So you can't actually you can't put a plan.
Yeah.
However, there are, people from really what I would say abused and stigmatized subcultures, which is part of my specialization in social science. They don't have the average person doesn't have a role model of someone who's gotten past. So I can't from the outside judge them for being a victim, whatever, I don't know the term, but being obsessed with their victim identity. I don't feel like I can judge those people because they've never had a role. When I've had setbacks in my life, I've had a role model. And I've heard the stories, right? And I think that's so easy to underestimate. I would imagine, especially as a clinician, if you're working with people who are coming from those backgrounds. If they don't have a role model, this becomes a much more challenging clinical task to actually talk them into hope.
Yeah.
Because why should they have any hope?
Yeah.
Statistically, show me the numbers.
Yeah.
But whereas it's easier for me to convert from basically whining to hope. And I think it's a natural response.
Yeah.
Because playing the pitiable victim for a very short period of time is an ancient human way to invoke the community. It's a cry for the community to come in. So I don't have a problem with that. I think what we're talking about is when it just becomes it becomes your lifestyle. Yeah. And my therapeutic breakthrough is related to that. It's not very impressive from a victimization standpoint, but it doesn't really matter for the individual. You have to get past your own BS. And so for me, it was the inability to grieve the abandonment of the academic career.
Yeah.
And that took me, I had to get that up to the surface and just deal with it and deal with some other weaknesses that I have had as a person and still have, which is related to social skills. I had to take that as a serious challenge. I couldn't be 32 and pretend that social skills deficits are not my problem. Sorry,
Right.
not my problem.
Yeah.
I know that sounds ridiculous to some listeners, but this is the alienation that people are they're allowed to get to 32 without taking that seriously. Is the point of my book, right? Is that you can create this little lifestyle bubble for yourself and just avoid all sorts of things other people consider normal.
Mm-hmm.
And that can drive you into a real dip.
Yeah.
And people won't intervene because they don't know.
Right.
When I was corrected all the time behaviorally in India, and as an American, it really pissed me off in the beginning.
Yeah.
I was just like, you don't even know me. Don't comment on my personality. Go away.
Right.
And it wasn't really actually a personal thing. This is what a communal society in a functioning neighborhood, so it does.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that serves a purpose in building resiliency? Because if
Yes.
people don't give you that immediate feedback, you tend to develop blind spots. And
Yep.
yeah, in fact, you become very rigid in your blind spots. And then the second you realize that maybe you're doing something wrong or something doesn't go your way as an adult, you don't have the resilience or the ability or the openness actually to be able to incorporate that feedback the world is offering. Whereas that direct feedback perhaps can help you shape yourself earlier. Now, again, it depends on your temperament and your personality,
Right.
and your ability to accept that feedback. But at some point, if it happens often enough, especially in that cultural standpoint, then the choice is yours, right? Like either you want to fit in or you want to be isolated. And then that's conscious choice you're also making.
Yeah, I think related to what you're saying, I've always felt, and I've experienced it myself, I think in America, especially, perhaps Canada as well, there's a real hard time. Urban people have a hard time distinguishing personal feedback and group. I don't know that we actually can figure it out.
Right.
And the way that we interact with each other actually works against getting to. And we don't have rituals to do. So my favorite punching bag here is the one-on-one performance. And I've had them. I didn't just read about it. And as a social scientist, I would go through it and I'm like, this is so bizarre, right? It's like some of this stuff, as you're getting the feedback, it's, why didn't you just come into my office and talk? But
Yeah.
why didn't you, yeah, but why did you wait 12? That was first thought. Second thought was, you're claiming in front of me that there's all these people, like in my case, who didn't want to work with me because they found my personality too difficult. But they as a group didn't come in and talk. Apparently that's anathema. I guess we don't do that.
Yeah.
But you know what? Properly structured, that would have been highly effective. But see, we don't do that. In an individualistic society, every problem is turned into an individual level problem. I guess the problem started with you and the solution is with you.
Right.
And I think the problem with a lot of the debate around victimhood, and I wrote a Substack piece on this, is that the problem with the victim identity is that the solution to whatever got you there emotionally has nothing to do with the victim perpetrator axis. That has to be grieved and moved beyond. Then you can step to the right or left and work on personal transformation, whatever it is, so that you can better adapt to the world that basically just screwed you. You don't have to deny that there are external forces. You can't sit there and wallow in it.
Yeah.
And then just sit there and whine.
Yeah.
But the problem is that people don't actually grieve. And so what they're doing is they're fighting with the perpetrator as they try to adapt and find a solution. That's where you get, like the guy in India talked about, who's just, every problem in his life is because he's untouchable.
Right. Yeah.
Even though most of his problems were self-created.
Yeah. Do you feel like the social structure then also plays a role in enabling that victim mentality? Because you and I also chatted about affirmative action, right? So I feel affirmative action falls into this and the role that plays in enabling some of these behaviors or the mindset around being in.
Yeah, I find what's happened to that movement to be tragic, and some of it was foreseeable. I think when I was at Harvard, which is perfect, in the early 90s, it was a perfect laboratory to see what traditional affirmative action was yielding at elite colleges. And what I found was that it was really good at getting highly privileged folks from minority backgrounds access to superior education.
Right.
Which was, quite honestly, historically relegated to Boston Brahmins and the like. The people, in other words, the people I was meeting at Harvard campus who were from disadvantaged minority groups actually were not socially disadvantaged people. So they did well. It was like they got a lot out of it. They milked it. It was very useful for them. But I don't know that their social advantage changed much by going to Harvard. Yeah. So I was sitting there going, this is great. Wait, what was the problem we're solving? That's what I was thinking. Wait, what was the problem we're solving? Oh, the problem is enhancing opportunity for underprivileged people. Okay, yeah, and that does statistically correlate with certain racial groups. Okay. Then why would you wait till they're 18? Now, this is a huge debate.
Yeah.
Is where do we intervene to boost up opportunity amongst the disadvantaged? Talk to any early childhood educator and they'll tell you kindergarten. It's over. Most of class mobility is determined by what's going on at that age. That's the reality. There are people who, like my dad, who pull it out of their behind because they're super high aberrant IQ. So that's also not an interesting case. So we've got a system where the high IQ from disadvantaged backgrounds, whether you're black or white, probably will find a way.
Right.
And that's distracted us from the fact that we're not actually spreading the opportunities properly. And we're actually waiting to do it at college. It's a very elitist view that you would solve the problem at college.
So what
totally misses the point.
What I'm hearing from you is then at that point, it's too late.
Yeah, you're not reaching underprivileged people.
Right.
You aren't. They may be African-American, but they're not. And that's not what I saw.
Yeah. But then that goes to the debate of equal opportunity versus quality of outcome, essentially.
Yeah. And I think no one wants to have that debate openly, but that's really what people are still talking past each other all the time. Right. And I don't think most Americans don't want to live in a society forcing equality of outcome because that is a hard socialist state. Right. I don't think most people really want to sign up. And equality of opportunity, I think most people are on board with it. And that was the original intent
Right.
of the EEOC, affirmative action, was give more opportunity. But you're waiting till they're 18 because you're presuming that the way to boost people from poverty is to hand them a college degree. That is literally one of the most myopic assumptions that people who look like me, who made, in the 50s and 60s. And I guess they were doing their best, but it wasn't based on a lot of research. So we're smarter and better research now.
Right.
But the funny thing is we're not succeeding at all in preschool level.
Yeah. And I think unintended consequence there is it leads to a sense of entitlement as well, which we're seeing play out. And that's causing a lot of issues as well in this current social structure.
Yeah, I think what I find tragic too is if you've got people who are not, their class position would have probably panned out just fine, not going to Harvard, to be honest, as would have mine. Who become the defenders of something that was actually designed for people in a very different way. And so the social outcome the program was interested in is not really being served in an honest manner. And there are people gaming the system. I had a dorm mate who sat at dinner in the dining hall, and literally she's half Bengali and half Latino, and she literally actually I was not very nice, but she's sitting across and she's literally talking to us like, how do I fill out my grad school application? Which one do I pick? And me being kind of an ass-beat jerk, I basically said, well, it's a game. This is a game. So you pick the most disadvantaged identity. Play the game. Which she thought was way too cynical a comment. You're talking about somebody who's the daughter of a surgeon. I'm just sitting there going, the fact that she was bringing it up as like some neurotic thing, well, I'd want to strangle her. I'm like, do you realize like the thousands of people were never held in kindergarten who could be also filling out the app?
Yeah.
So anyways, I think people forget that some component of affirmative action is absolutely a power struggle, and that's just say it. It is. And I don't think that's bad. But we try to hide behind it.
Yeah.
Come on. These are historically abused, disadvantaged groups, right? So once a slice of people get educated, they're going to, but we have to distinguish the power seeking from, are we actually spreading opportunity?
Yeah. And historically, it's always been there, right? So it's not something
it's human behavior.
Where we're being naive and we're in fact deceiving ourselves if we say that we're not addicted to or enticed by power.
The other irony for kind of the whole affirmative action thing is where are we trying to intervene? It's not just 18 years old, but the assumption is so individualistic. We'll intervene when you're 18 and we'll help you with your individual educational journey.
Right.
Make sure your CV looks great.
Yeah.
For this individual society you need to thrive in. So it fits in totally, that the assumptions make sense to me, but they're not how a real communitarian like policy world would actually think if it existed. Right. It would be thinking much more like the early childhood educational team. It's like, hey, we lose these kids at kindergarten, all right? Because if their home life is so messed up that they can't even pay attention in kindergarten, it's over.
Right.
They will take 4 grades to learn how to read, and then it's all down. And then someone raises their hand and says, why'd they join a gang? I don't know, because you didn't support them. And that's why. But see, we don't want to accept that. It's a terrifying set. That really terrifies people to admit the level of neglect we allow to go on in these communities. So it's a lot easier to focus over here. College applications, let's help people there. Except that can be gained.
Mm-hmm.
And did.
Yeah. James, I think we've explored quite a bit. I think we've highlighted quite a few things here, and I think this has been quite the conversation. Definitely has given me a lot to think about, but I appreciate you sharing your personal story and some of the experiences you've had and what the learnings you've had from those experiences in terms of it's always interesting to contrast different cultures and see what comes out. So appreciate your view on all of that. Now, for listeners that want to find your work, I know you referred to your book and your Substack, but what are some ways they can find all of that?
If you go to jamesrichardson.substack.com, that's the landing page for my publication. That's an easy place if you want to more essays that I write. I write them every week. Easy snack size consumption. If you really want to ruin a weekend, you can buy this 480-page monster here, in which you will be given a grand cultural tour of how individualism works in everyday life. That's on Amazon.
Okay,
Our worst strength. Type it into the search bar. It will pop up.
perfect. Put all of that in the show notes. But thanks again, James. This was a great conversation. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.